That's exactly typical of him and his 14-year-old mentality. Everything that's gone wrong on the immigration front in Canada is 100% attributable to Justin Trudeau and his pack of demented minions.
Blind, manipulated.
Dr. Jordan Peterson, never one to mince words, has delivered a scathing critique of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, asserting that the leader has never spoken a genuine word.
I think our leader, Trudeau, I don't think I've ever heard him say a true word. I think he's at least narcissistic, at minimum. And I think he's enabled by the useful idiots of the liberal left.
Now, it's gone so badly in Canada that he has no choice but to reverse course. And then to see him flailing around to find someone to blame is exactly as pathetic as you'd expect from someone like him.
All this nonsense about compassion is the manipulations of snakes pulling in the useful idiots, who perhaps are genuinely compassionate, to further their unbelievably narrowly self-centered and destructive agenda. And that's Canada in a nutshell. And Canadians are shocked by this, because they're shocked into disbelief, I would say, because for 175 years or thereabouts, our institutions were reliable, derived as they were from Great Britain, which produced reliable institutions for all sorts of miraculous reasons. You could trust the political parties. The Socialists were a Labour Party, Conservatives were a party of big business, the Liberals kind of played both ends against the middle and were centrists, and they were usually in power, and all things considered, that didn't work out too badly. When we got tired of them, we could elect the Conservatives, which happened now and then federally, or the Socialists or the Conservatives, which happened fairly regularly provincially, and the whole damn country functioned well. The education system worked, the higher education systems were, we don't have Harvard or Stanford, but all our universities were pretty damn good. Canada was a very stable, middle-class country with reliable institutions, and the media as well. Even CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, when I grew up, it was fundamentally trustworthy. Probably tilted somewhat to the left, insofar as things were tilted towards the left, say in the 70s and so on, but you could assume that the journalists at CBC were journalists, not propagandists. And it was the same we had CTV, which was the main private competitor, and the same thing obtained there. And that's all. To say that's gone is to say almost nothing. Canadians have no idea what to do with that.
In Peterson's view, Trudeau embodies a narcissistic persona, skillfully veiling his ambitions with curated platitudes and an unrelenting image of virtue. He goes further, accusing Trudeau of being propped up by what he terms useful idiots on the liberal left. Peterson expresses concern over Trudeau's attempts to detach Canada from its colonial British history and identity. He accuses Trudeau of lacking principles, suggesting that his actions are driven by a desire for moral advantage rather than genuine beliefs.
That's what he says he's doing. You see, the thing about him and his minions is I don't trust them at all. I think that what Trudeau is doing is testing his fingers in the wind constantly to see where the easiest moral advantage can be obtained, and then driving down that direction as fast as he possibly can. I don't believe for a second that he has any such thing as principles. It doesn't look, because I don't think anybody who lies with every single word and gesture ever has principles. And I know, for example, this was definitely true during the pandemic. This was true not only of the Liberals, Trudeau's party, but also of the Conservatives and the Socialists, is that during the pandemic, all our politicians did nothing but sample opinion poll constantly.
When we see images of people out enjoying the sunshine in large groups, that is extremely concerning, because they are not just putting themselves at risk, they are putting everyone else at risk.
But for 2 weeks now, these protesters have laid siege to this city. A state of emergency has now been declared in Ontario to give police more powers to shut down demonstrations. But most insist they're not going anywhere.
We can be here as long as it takes. We're well supported food-wise, fuel-wise, financially.
And then derive policy as a consequence of sampling the very people that they frightened with their propagandistic idiocy, and then produce policy, and then pretend as an outright, complete bloody lie that it was the science leading it. And that's how Trudeau governs in relationship to everything. He looks for the easiest moral advantage. We're saving the planet. It's like, yeah, I don't think so, buddy. It's not an easy thing to do to save the planet. And what are we going to do? We're going to go down Germany, the route of Germany, where electricity is now unreliable, super expensive, and 10 times as polluting in terms of carbon output per unit of electricity than France. We're slaughtering our fossil fuel industry, which basically means we're just handing it over to the Chinese, the whole fossil fuel enterprise. I'm sure they're just laughing up their sleeves at our complete bloody idiocy. Hypothetically, Trudeau is trying to tip us away from our colonial past, but I don't believe any of this is political. I think that he's a narcissistic dark tetrad type, and he'll use whatever machinations, him and Stephen Guilbeault, that bloody minister hypothetically responsible for energy and the environment, to the degree they overlap. He's such a bloody poser. And so Canadians have no idea what Trudeau is and don't want to know.
Peterson's words delve into the soul of Canadian society itself. Are these developments symptoms of a delusional idealism, a paranoid retreat from traditional values, or evidence of a stable and evolving democracy? Under Trudeau's tenure, Canada finds itself at a crossroads, grappling with questions of identity, governance, and the balance between progressivism and freedom. For Peterson and his supporters, this debate isn't just about policy, but about the very future of Canadian civilization.
I think we've gone further down the woke road than any other place, except perhaps for California. I think part of the reason for that is that we were an early adopter of the doctrines of group rights. So back in the 1980s, Canada has almost split apart twice in recent years, and very, very close. There were 2 referenda, and both of them, to call the results marginal is to say almost nothing. It was fractions of a percent that kept the country together. And in the 1980s, Trudeau's father, who was also quite the piece of work, repatriated, so to speak, our Constitution. And I suppose that was in part because the French, the Francophones, so to speak, weren't very happy that we were still in some ways governed by Great Britain, although as far as I'm concerned, that was a perfectly good deal, especially compared to the alternative. And so we tried to bring the Constitution back, and did so, and produced a new Charter of Rights and a new Constitution, and bent ourselves into knots trying to get Quebec to sign, and in doing so, weakened the structural foundations of the Constitution and the Charter of Rights to a degree that really, I think, makes them not worth the paper they're written on, and in a failed attempt to actually bring Quebec back into the fold. But in doing so, we also agreed that groups had rights. The Francophones had rights, the Indigenous people as a group had rights, the Anglophones had rights. There were 3 founding peoples, and group and individual rights had to be balanced. And I don't think there is any such thing as group rights, because there's no such thing as group responsibility. So it's a non-starter conceptually. In some ways, the table was set in Canada for the rise of a more universal doctrine of group identity and group rights. And plus, Canadians pride themselves on being nice, let's say, and not being offensive, and just hoping that everyone will get along. And there's nothing glorious about incivility, but there's very little to distinguish excessive niceness from weakness. And the problem with being nice, and this is a technical problem because niceness is associated with trait agreeableness, is that agreeable people are cannon fodder for psychopaths. And biologists have modeled this. So, for example, if you put together automated communities of reciprocal cooperative traders, they do very well. The whole pot expands. But if you throw one psychopath into the mix, he takes everything. And the reason for that is that if you're too agreeable, the dark tetrad types, the predatory parasites, they'll take you out. And they'll use your compassion as a weapon against you. People who suffer from the psychopathologies or manifest the psychopathologies that are associated with quasi-psychopathic traits are very much prone to using victimization as a weapon. I don't believe that any of the conundrum that we're in at the moment in the West is strictly political. I think what's happened is that the predatory psychopaths have figured out how to cloak themselves in the guise of compassion, and their machinations are enabled online. And this is dangerous beyond belief. Now, about 3% of human beings have a parasitical bent. They would be high in extroversion, low in agreeableness, low in conscientiousness. And there's a niche for psychopaths. And the niche is, especially for psychopathic men, is psychopathic men mimic confidence. So they look competent and they can fool young women. And that's how they propagate themselves. But generally speaking, the psychopaths never increase in number beyond about 3 to 5% of the population, stable cross-culturally. So if the psychopath prevalence falls to 1%, everybody forgets about them, everybody starts being nice, and then the psychopaths can start to flourish. But once they get up to about 5%, everybody thinks, uh-oh, the snakes have come back, and they start to beat them back, and so it stabilizes at about 3%. So there's a niche there, an evolutionary niche. The danger in that is that now and then the psychopaths get the upper hand. That's what happened in the Russian Revolution, for example. Very small percentage of the population who come together and are then, for one reason or another, enabled in a manner that enables them to circumvent our normal evolutionarily prepared responses to psychopathic predation. They can take down the whole society. And the problem we have, this is a deadly serious problem, is that there is no punishment for psychopaths online. They can do whatever the hell they want. And this could easily take us out. 35% of net traffic is pornography. And then how much of it do you think is outright criminality? I don't know an old person in Canada, I think this is true across the West, who hasn't been targeted by online criminals. They have databases on everyone old. They know where their bank accounts are. They're targeted constantly. And so there's immense criminal activity on the web.
Canada, rich in oil, gas, timber, and freshwater, should be among the world's wealthiest nations.
What we're doing in Canada on the energy front is utterly insane.
Yet, as Dr. Jordan Peterson critiques, its GDP per capita lags behind other developed countries. He blames burdensome regulations, stalled energy projects, and poor leadership under Trudeau, arguing that Canada squanders its vast resources. For Peterson, this failure to capitalize on its strengths is a troubling sign of mismanagement and ideological governance.
Well, here's a cardinal example. I mean, first of all, we have a province in Canada, Alberta, which has the third largest fossil fuel reserves in the world, and we're very good at utilizing them, let's say. They're rather dirty in some ways on the environmental front, but that's life, you might say. Our country, and certainly that province, could be rich at the level of Norway with any degree of reasonable management whatsoever, and I think that's true for the whole country. Quebec itself has enough natural gas to provision itself for 200 years, and they won't touch it for reasons that are so diluted that it defies comprehension. The Chancellor of Germany, who was a socialist, and that's relevant given that hypothetically he's in Trudeau's camp, came to Canada less than a year ago, cap in hand, because the Germans were desperate because they've been following idiot green policies for far too long. And Trudeau said, well, we can't make a business case for shipping you liquid natural gas. Well, and the reason for that is he made it impossible for anybody to make a business case to do that, even though the Germans were prepared to offer tens of billions of dollars to us on unbelievably favorable terms that were very long-term in scope. And so we turned away one of our greatest allies in the West, left them in the hands of the bloody Russians and the Qataris so that our idiot prime minister could virtue signal pointlessly about destroying the fossil fuel industry in a manner that will make Canada poor and help the world not one bit. And then the Prime Minister of Japan came and asked for the same thing and got exactly the same treatment. Now, Alberta is landlocked, unfortunately, and it's next to a province, the province British Columbia, and British Columbia is a coastal province, and it tends to be woke and socialist, partly because it has Vancouver attached to it. And so Alberta can't get its fossil fuel resources out to the world on the west coast. And so that's a complete bloody catastrophe. And the new premier there, Danielle Smith, she's going to end up essentially going to war with Trudeau.
Why is this happening? Is it leadership, policy, or a deeper societal complacency? And ultimately, who's to blame? These are questions every Canadian and global observer must confront.
Unless you're aiming at disruption and impoverishment and mass misery, every single bit of that reeks of failure by the criteria of the people who put the policies in place. And we're running down that road as fast as we can in Canada so that Trudeau can pretend that he is what? A paragon of moral virtue and keep up his grip on whatever the hell he regards as power.
Thanks for watching, and let us know your thoughts below.